Allora, buongiorno a tutti e benvenuti. Saluto ovviamente le persone presenti in sala, ma anche i tanti collegati da casa. Dunque, questa mattina siamo qui all'Università di Salerno dentro un contenitore in realtà più ampio, un progetto europeo. Questo è un po' un punto di arrivo di un percorso, come dire, più ampio, di più lungo periodo. Buongiorno. Il nostro convegno Occupied Spaces è ospitato oggi all'Università di Salerno dal Dipartimento del Dipsum. Abbiamo qua il direttore Carmine Pinto, che saluto e ringrazio ovviamente per l'ospitalità. E prima di cedere la parola a Francesco, che ovviamente inquadrerà un po' l'incontro di oggi, ovviamente cedo la parola a Carmine per i saluti. Grazie Carmine.
Sì, vabbè, è evidente che si tratta solo di un benvenuto. I saluti sono una cosa che andrebbe probabilmente abolita,
sì,
soprattutto nelle presentazioni di libri e cose simili. In questo caso appunto si tratta di un benvenuto e nient'altro. Tra l'altro Francesco è un nostro dottore di ricerca, quindi sta a casa sua, non siete ospiti, siamo felici di fare questo evento. Mi dispiace che Michela, che lavora qui da noi, non è presente, ma forse immagino che sarà collegata. E insomma, ho visto il programma, è una cosa a cui Francesco sta lavorando credo da molti anni, cioè ci investe tanto della sua passione, delle sue capacità, è un ricercatore molto brillante e quindi io penso che ovviamente sono contentissimo che avete scelto di fare questo appuntamento. Spero che sia anche un'occasione, immagino, per farne qualcosa più ampio sia in termini di pubblicazioni scientifiche che in termini di divulgazione, e quindi mi limito a dare un benvenuto, a salutare tutti i presenti, quelli che vedo abbastanza numerosi collegati online, e Mariangela ovviamente, che tanto si è impegnata per questo evento. Buon lavoro.
Grazie Carmine, grazie.
Grazie.
Francesco.
Grazie.
Lascio qui il libro per me.
Sì, il primo. Ti scrivo.
Grazie professore Pinto. Introdurrò brevemente il convegno di oggi.
Ti vuoi sedere di qua, così ti vedo meglio da casa? Scaliamo.
Proprio mi vogliono vedere.
Vai. Anche Carlo. Beh, Carlo lo facciamo intervenire dopo?
Sì, apologies for our international guests. We will try to do this a little bit in English, a little bit in Italian. I will do this introduction in Italian because I think the majority of people online are Italian, but then with the first session will be in English, so we'll do half and half. Potete spegnere i microfoni, grazie, chi è collegato online, per favore.
Così c'è la del caso, poi tagliata e...
Disattivo di tutto, grazie. Ok. Dunque, questo convegno Occupied Spaces, pratiche ed esperienze di occupazione europee ed extraeuropee tra Seconda Guerra Mondiale e Guerra Fredda. Come anticipava la collega Mariangela, fa parte di un progetto più ampio che si chiama Audiovisuals and Language Analysis Network for Cultural Heritage in Europe, Avalanche of Democracy, che è stato finanziato dal contributo CERV 2023 nell'ambito dei progetti dell'Unione Europea per Citizenship and European Remembrance. Questo convegno di oggi è stato pensato, ideato per adottare un approccio multidisciplinare ai concetti di spazio e di occupazione per quanto riguarda appunto sia la Seconda Guerra Mondiale che la Guerra Fredda, ovviamente vista come immediata conseguenza della prima, e soprattutto dei loro spazi occupati, sì, occupied spaces. Quindi durante questo incontro assisteremo a definizioni e redefinizioni del concetto di occupazione. Tradizionalmente per occupazione si intende l'imposizione di controllo e potere attraverso la violenza da parte di entità nazionali e o dei loro attori su determinati territori o gruppi di individui. Tuttavia vedremo come gli studiosi qui riuniti oggi hanno affrontato questo tema in maniera differente, utilizzando diversi contesti storici, geografici e culturali per analizzare appunto quello che da sempre è un concetto controverso e di difficile definizione. Quindi il focus della conferenza andrà oltre il contesto europeo, come vedremo molti interventi hanno un focus extraeuropeo, quindi ampliando l'analisi e guardando i diversi concetti di occupazione principalmente tramite la categoria dello spazio. Questo concetto di spazio però verrà analizzato nel contesto di un interesse crescente in anni recenti verso i processi di colonizzazione e decolonizzazione e verso altri fenomeni di guerra espansionistica, che è un tema quanto mai attuale purtroppo, dove appunto il concetto di spazio viene utilizzato come uno strumento per analizzare questi fenomeni complessi di relazione fra colonizzatore e colonizzato, occupante e occupato. Quindi anche questo concetto di spazio è stato ampliato ed esso diventa sia uno spazio geografico che non geografico, e quindi includerà anche, come vedrete in alcuni degli interventi di oggi, spazi di vita quotidiana e individualità, la lingua, la cultura, l'istruzione, il genere, la religione, l'etnia, la famiglia, e come questi cambiano e si trasformano nel contesto dell'occupazione. Io concludo qui la mia introduzione. Ringrazio anche io il professore Carmine Pinto e il Dipartimento di Studi Umanistici dell'Università di Salerno per averci occupato. Abbiamo occupato noi per averci ospitato, la collega Mariangela Palmieri per il suo impagabile contributo, tutti i nostri ospiti, gli studiosi senza i quali non sarebbe stato possibile, l'associazione Mumbat, che ora interverrà il presidente Carlo Bruno, e ricordo che insomma, i contenuti di questa conferenza verranno poi pubblicati nel prossimo numero della rivista Occupied Italy, che appunto fa capo all'associazione. Quindi lascio la parola a Carlo per un'altra brevissima introduzione e poi passiamo al primo panel.
Sì, buongiorno a tutti, grazie di essere qui. Io prendo proprio 30 secondi solo per salutare, perché è vero che dovrebbero essere aboliti, però i ringraziamenti sono d'obbligo per chi come voi spesso ha dovuto affrontare anche lunghi viaggi, soprattutto ieri, in una giornata assolutamente terribile per i trasferimenti in Italia. Quindi grazie di essere qui. L'associazione promuove la rivista Occupied Italy proprio perché intende promuovere la conoscenza dell'operazione Avalanche e di tutte le conseguenze che ha determinato. Per questo ringrazio anche lo staff editoriale, che è qui rappresentato per il momento da Mariangela e Francesco, ma ci sono tante colleghe che si occupano della rivista, e ringrazio l'università. Vi lascio così, lascio tutto il tempo ai relatori. Grazie ancora di essere venuti qui.
Darei giusto qualche indicazione logistica, magari chiamare un relatore alla volta, poiché lo spazio non è molto ampio, farlo accomodare qui al centro. Quindi lascio la parola a Francesco, che modererà questa prima sessione in modalità bilingue, immagino.
Buongiorno. Introduco appunto i relatori del primo panel facendo le veci della collega Maria Michela Lanti, che come diceva il professore Pinto non è qui per ragioni di malattia, e la salutiamo, la ringraziamo come tutte le colleghe dello staff della rivista, e quindi introduco brevemente tutti i relatori del panel e poi do loro la parola e passo all'inglese. Okay, so I will briefly introduce the members of the first panel of the conference, and then I will give them the stage. So in this first panel we have focused on extra-Italian perspectives, so we will look outside of Italy, while the second panel will be focused on Italy. So we have the pleasure to have here with us today Michael Auwers, forgive me if I butcher your names and surnames, from the State Archives of Belgium's Study Center for War and Society, who will present his paper titled From Liberators to Occupiers, the British Occupation of Belgium in the Early Cold War. Then we will have Nicholas Virtue from King's University College from London, Ontario, Canada, with the spatial imaginary of the Balkans in Second World War Italian service newspapers. Then I'm sure I will not say this right, forgive me.
Nobody says it's all right.
Katarzyna
That's perfect. Yes, very good.
Yaros
Yes.
from the University of Wrocław, more or less. And her paper is titled Red Shadows, Soviet Presence Through the Lens of Lieu de Mémoire in Central Asia. And finally, Ornella Castiglione from Università Milano Bicocca. And we will go back to the Balkans, which is interesting. So we'll have two papers that will approach the same geographical area. It will be very interesting to hear the discussion with I Balcani nel cinema, storie e immagini di territori occupati. Okay, so I will ask Michael if you can please join us here.
Perfetto.
Si vede Carlo tutto?
Sì.
Okay, thanks to the organizer of this conference for having invited me. Thank you, Francesco, for the introduction. I will talk today about the establishment of British military bases in Belgium in the early 1950s in a part of the North Belgian countryside called the Kempen. My focus today will be the representation of this event in Belgian media, in national dailies and in local weeklies. To introduce the topic, I'd like to quote from a Belgian weekly published in late August 1951. No Russians, but no English either. We want to fight for Belgium, but for no strangers. Away with all the strangers, and away with the traitor government that sells us out. First one betrays the king, then one betrays his most loyal supporters, the Kempen people, the farming people, farmers. Stand up, the king is gone. And immediately foreign occupation to arms against this treachery. So this weekly was published by a far-right group of ultra-royalists. These are fierce supporters of the former king. It was not widely read, but I nevertheless use it because I think it ties together three political conflicts which help us to understand the framing of these British army bases as an occupation. So the first is the conflict that arose from the expropriations of farming lands necessary for the camps. This conflict, I will argue, functioned as a proxy for the deepest political conflict of Belgian history, that is the royal question. The question whether Leopold III, the person you see on the left-hand side on the picture, could remain king of the Belgians. This is a conflict which had lasted for 10 years in the summer of 1951. That actually started when the First World War had erupted and when the king had decided not to follow the government in exile, but to remain with his people in soon-to-be occupied Belgium. It was formally solved only in the summer of 1951, when Leopold's son, Baudouin, the young guy next to the king, took the throne. In the meantime, however, large sections of public opinion had taken great offense at the king's new order ideology and at his second marriage in wartime. So the question whether the king could stay on or not had deeply divided the country. While the Flemish Dutch speakers in the north were generally in favor, the Walloons French-speaking people in the south were generally opposed. As to the political parties, the Catholics were very much in favor, whereas the socialists, the communists, and the liberals were opposed. The Catholics was the major political force in that time. And thirdly, I will argue that a major international political conflict, the Cold War, actually helped prevent this local political conflict due to the coming of the British bases to successfully reignite the national political conflict caused by the royal question. A second reason why I chose this quote to start my presentation is because the potential spread of the ideas captured in it was taken seriously by the Belgian governing party, the Catholic Party. The Catholic Party, which in the 1950 elections had obtained an absolute majority in parliament. And this was in no small part thanks to votes from people from the North Belgian countryside, a region where more than 80% of the people had voted for the Catholic Party. So in what follows, and I'll try to proceed to my next slides, if it works. Okay. So in what follows, I will first briefly sketch the diplomatic context that shaped the decision to establish these British bases in this region, and then I'll more elaborately, in 3 chronological phases, explain its reception in Belgian media, taking a closer look at the discourses of occupation by national and local journalists. So I want to evaluate to which extent representations of the British Army's coming were conditioned by either memories of World War II occupation or by the prospect of a Cold War which could suddenly turn hot. As for World War II, I should mention that the hostile occupation of Belgium by Germany's Wehrmacht was followed from late 1944 onwards by a friendly occupation by primarily British troops. So as to the international political context, in 1951, it's probably fair to say that Soviet troops invading Western Europe at the time was one of the main Western doom images of the early Cold War. In that scenario, Western Germany was the first line of defense. Since the end of the Second World War, British soldiers, as you can see on the map, had occupied the north while the Americans were in the south. In the event of a massive Soviet attack, however, Western forces would have to fall back behind the Rhine. It's the line in blue on the map. And that line could only hold if extra troops were rapidly mobilized. And that's why the Americans negotiated with the French to set up transit camps in France to be able to more swiftly mobilize their troops and supply them. The British opted for Belgium, primarily because there were excellent transport connections between the ports of Antwerp and the British headquarters in Germany near the Rhine. So in this otherwise so quiet region in spring 1951, there were rumors that entire villages would disappear to make way for a huge British-controlled military area. From May onwards, many families had indeed received letters from the Belgian Defense Ministry stating that their home and lands would soon be expropriated. So studying the media reception of these events, I found that they were first picked up by a Catholic daily from the city of Antwerp, het Handelsblad. The journalist was quite clear about who the conflict's victims were, the local farmers obviously. The perpetrators then were not so much the Belgian Defense Ministry, but rather the British. So in a lengthy front page article, my PowerPoint seems to go a bit faster than my presentation itself, but in a lengthy front page article, the journalist opposed the title "British Army expropriates 800 hectares" to the subtitle "Scores of farmers thrown out." And he moreover asserted that the Kempen people shared his view. Quote, "Like fire it ran from homestead to homestead. The English soldiers are confiscating everything. They did indeed go from house to house, and usually without an interpreter, made the inhabitants aware that their homes were becoming military domain." Sorry.
Did you have the automatic?
I have no idea what actually happened. I might have done this by accident. Okay. But so the question I will manage it on the spot. No worry. So the question I was wondering, why did this journalist put all the blame on the British? I wondered whether this decision had anything to do with the royal question. The timing is indeed telling. His article was published 1 month before Leopold's formal abdication, and het Handelsblad was one of many Catholic newspapers which had fervently supported the king. The literature on these newspaper stands towards the royal question actually argues that the Cold War greatly increased polarization on the editorial boards. And it created a certain paranoia in the sense that the journalists believed in a communist plot driven from abroad to replace the monarchy with a communist republic. This was not exceptional in Western Europe at the time, obviously. To them, Leopold III was the paladin of Christian civilization and a solid dam against the red tide. Particularly interesting is that opinion pieces from 1950, that is a year before the time I study, but at the height of the royal question, occasionally suggested that also English agents were maneuvering to eliminate the king. It was not a widespread conviction, but the idea was out there, and it could have stimulated Catholic journalists to hold the British responsible for the sorrows of Kempen farmers 1 year later. This was my idea. However, for most of the summer of 1951, the idea that the British were guilty for the misfortunes of Kempen farmers was hardly anywhere to be found outside of the Handelsblad in other Belgian dailies. It did not appear either in the local weeklies, so the weeklies published in the Kempen towns. So how to explain this absence? Well, on the one hand, I found that a very different memory about the English condition, the way the local authors regarded the coming of British soldiers. The main weekly of the largest Kempen town stated, "We have nothing against the English, obviously. Quite the contrary, we will never forget the excellent services they have rendered during the last war." Indeed, British soldiers were still seen primarily as the liberators of the Kempen from the German occupier. And this was not as self-evident as it might seem. Liberation was indeed followed by this friendly occupation by the British, but one which had gradually caused what one historian has called irritations of occupation. These included local young men experiencing unfair marriage market competition, young women being harassed by drunken soldiers, and more generally, the British requisitioning building materials and other supplies, as well as public and private spaces for administration and billeting. Collective memory, however, might have silenced these negative recollections of the British passage. On the other hand, local journalists also appreciated the advantages in terms of employment the military bases could bring. Indeed, nowhere in Belgium unemployment was higher than in their region. They also stressed the necessity of contributing to the defense of Western Europe, as the quote which has popped up shows. It states that we would rather have a British army than a Russian occupation, rather work and bread for our workers at home than mass deportation to the mines of Siberia. It's indeed hard to disagree with this way of presenting stakes. This quotation is actually one of a few in the Belgian press published before late August 1951, which contains the word occupation, but tellingly it is put in clear opposition with the establishment of British military bases. Still, as the effects of the expropriations became more tangible, it could be expected that political players who did not accept the West European Cold War narrative would try to capitalize on local frustrations. This obviously goes for the Belgian Communist Party, but I chose to leave them out of the equation. The reason is, so this Communist Party, obviously they would incessantly refer to the coming of the British bases as the beginning of the occupation of Belgium, but they didn't have any significant influence in rural Belgium, and also the 1950 elections had really eliminated their national power base. But on the other side of the political spectrum, however, resided groups who equally opposed the Atlanticist discourse of the Catholic socialist and liberal parties. And this brings us back to the quotation with which I started this paper. As the quote shows, the ultra-royalist group which published this piece still clung to a foreign policy of neutrality, which was Leopold III's policy, and which had led the king to state in 1944 that he considered the Allied liberation of 1944 just as the German one as a hostile occupation. So this discourse was more or less copied by these ultra-royalists, who from September 1951 onwards also campaigned intensively in the Kempen, in this rural region, using flyers with on the front the king's portraits, portrayed between lines such as above, why was he chased out, and below, he did not tolerate the enslavement by the British, that is, of our people. And so, and the message that the Kempen was suffering from British occupation was generally put on the back. So these ultra-royalists basically presented the coming of the British soldiers as an encroachment on national sovereignty, and even went as far as to frame it as a form of colonialism. All this troubled Catholic journalists of the major newspapers, who knew perfectly well that in the Kempen, support for Leopold III was almost unanimous. And they were only more worried when in autumn 1951 several local weeklies started to negatively portray the British. This is a change in representation. One weekly even copied the ultra-royalist discourse of British occupation, as you can read here. So this is the English occupation of this country, and authoritative circles would have confirmed that Leopold had to leave precisely because he opposed this British kind of like imperialism. This was a weekly which also labeled the future military occupation as colonization, and this framing appeared as well in one of the national newspapers, as this cartoon shows. So what you see here is a reference to the struggle of Egyptian nationalists to shed off the last remnants of British colonial rule. This was daily front-page news at the time, and it inspired this cartoonist to compare the British bases, the British military bases in Belgium, with the situation in Egypt, where the British dominated transit over the Suez Canal. Albert Canal is the canal where the bases in Belgium would be built. So in the article I analyze these cartoons a bit further, but I'm going to skip this here to try to finish my story a bit in time. So what was interesting now is that is the reaction of the Catholic dailies close to the government elite. The discussion, in fact, was actually conducted largely up to this point within the larger Catholic political family. But so what these major Catholic dailies now try to do is to try to cast the blame for the establishment of British army bases elsewhere, that is, on Belgian socialists. The coming of the British to the Kempen, Catholic journalists started arguing from late December 1951 onwards, was the consequence of a secret treaty negotiated at the end of the Second World War between the socialist leader Paul-Henri Spaak on the one hand and the British Foreign Minister Anthony Eden on the other hand. Of course, it soon turned out that the coming of the bases was entirely negotiated during the current Catholic reign, and this incited socialist MPs to react and to interpellate the Catholic Foreign Minister in Parliament. So again, the major Catholic newspapers had to react, and they did so in an ambivalent way. On the one hand, they stopped attacking the socialists and even urged them to withdraw the interpellation. They now even invoked the Cold War, arguing for military secrecy, as you can read here, should the Russians know where the camps are located. On the other hand, however, they now started publishing the speeches of the ultra-royalists, speeches which they had condemned before and which were very violently anti-British and anti-socialist, but they now published them in their journals. In one Catholic daily, the title "British Base in the Kempen, the Beginning of English Occupation because of Secret Agreements in London" was followed. So this title was followed by extensive quotations from speakers who asserted that in 1944-1945 we already had an English occupation which was in no way different from the military occupation by the Germans during the war. In other words, readers were once more presented with the sequence: secret agreements in London, post-war British occupation of Belgium, removal of King Leopold III, Cold War British occupation of Belgium. And this is when the socialists took action. They did not accept that the Catholic press spread fake news that accused them of subordinating Belgian sovereignty to British interests. They now accuse their Catholic colleagues of wanting to restart the royal question in a way that threatened to cloud relations between Belgium and England and make Belgium pay the price. Surprisingly enough, the leading Catholic newspapers fairly quickly came to accept the socialist reasoning. The quotes from an opinion piece projected here capture this acceptance well. The author now unequivocally denounced the ultra-royalists as extremists whose language sounded like that of World War II collaborationist parties. That's okay. He reiterated that in the context of Western defense, foreign bases are inevitable, and he expressed satisfaction that the legend of the so-called secret agreements of London was dispelled, and that from now on the focus should be on the positive effects of the British camps on employment in the Kempen. I think this nicely summarizes the consensus accepted by most national dailies and local weeklies from late March 1952 onwards, as a result of which the discourse of British occupation gradually vanished. So, to conclude, the media discussion I presented here boiled down actually to the choice between a British military presence in rural Belgium on the one hand and the prospect of a Soviet-Russian occupation of the entire country. The Belgian journalists I studied all accepted the hegemonic Cold War narrative that the Russian occupation was to be avoided at all costs. Ultra-royalist writers, however, minimized the risk of a future Russian occupation and refuted that British bases were an acceptable remedy. Their strategy to frame the British presence as an occupation or even colonization was briefly and modestly successful among a few Catholic journalists. This was due to, first, the experiences of occupation of these journalists during the Second World War. Some of them might indeed not have regarded the German occupation of 1940-1944 as particularly hostile, but maybe friendly in case they were former collaborators, or even, or at least peaceful, and the subsequent English occupation the other way around. This applied to a small group of journalists, but nonetheless they wrote and published their articles in national dailies. Second, the decline of the British Empire. It was a prominent theme in the press globally, and for Belgian journalists it facilitated making analogies between the Kempen case and local resistance to British occupation or colonialism elsewhere in the world. How false these analogies could be. It was a rhetorical device which was facilitated by the omnipresence of this story in the press. And thirdly, the remnants of the controversy over the return of Leopold III. Far-right groups had tried to make the idea of the British Guild central to the discussion about the establishment of military bases. Leopold III indeed personified pre-war neutrality, and the ultra-royalists argued that his removal was orchestrated by the British so that they could integrate Belgium into their empire. On the whole, however, and I'm finishing now, on the whole, however, the discourse of a British occupation did not really catch on. And the reasons for this were that the ultra-royalists' arguments were actually no match for a reading of the Second World War that presented the British as liberators rather than occupiers. This was the hegemonic narrative. More importantly, actually, and this is also because I studied the Cold War and tried to attach some importance to this major event, more importantly, the idea of British occupation proved difficult to reconcile with the ideological framework created by the Cold War. After all, the British were now a necessary partner in curbing the Soviet threat. Moreover, negotiations for the military bases were bilateral, but they could easily be subsumed into the fundamental multilateralism of the Cold War, which also had cultural dimensions. Both NATO and West European unification indeed offered Belgian Catholic journalists the enticing prospect of an anti-communist Christian Occident. So, final sentence, all this, I think... Okay, so all this, I think, points to the dynamic nature of prospects of occupation. I think that structural factors such as changing geopolitical constellations from the beginning of the Second World War until the Cold War define the limits of how occupations were perceived and could be framed. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Michael Auwers. Very, very interesting. I hope we'll have a discussion. Speaking of which, we will leave the questions for the end of each panel. So if you have questions for our speakers, please write them down, and we will have a Q&A session at the end of the panel. Okay.